The Sony a6000 was released back in 2014. Nowadays you can find it used for around $300. The Sony a5000 was also released in 2014, but it only goes for about $130. And the Sony NEX5r was released all the way back in 2012, but it still sells for about $130. Which one of these budget cameras is best for you? In terms of overall build quality, the a6000 has a more traditional styling. You know, you've got a mode dial on top and a bunch of customizable buttons. The NEX5r and the a5000, on the other hand, don't have a mode dial. Most of their settings are changed via either menus or the little scroll wheel on the back. In terms of overall build quality though, the NEX5r actually is much better than the other two. It's a really sturdy metal design. The a6000 is a little bit kind of lightweight and plasticky, though it's like a nice sort of fancy plastic, whereas the a5000 is an entry-level camera and it just feels cheap, lightweight, very, very plasticky. In terms of overall design, I'd give it to the a6000. In terms of build quality, I'd give it to the NEX5r. Also, definitely worth noting, the a6000 does not have a flip-up screen, whereas both the NEX5r and the Sony a5000 do have flip-up screens. In terms of a mic input, none of these cameras have a mic input, so that's kind of a bummer. If you're filming with any of these three cameras, you're either going to have to rely on the camera's onboard audio, or you're going to have to use like a lav mic into an external recorder. In terms of video features, none of these cameras do 4K, but they all do 1080p and they do it really well. Sony a6000 comes out on top here because it just has more features than the other two. I mean, you've got 1080p at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second. And it gives you the ability to record in both AVC HD and XAVCS, not to mention that weird little 4x3 MP4 format that a lot of these Sony cameras have. The Sony NEX5r, on the other hand, only gives you 24 and 60 frames per second. And the Sony a5000 kind of comes in third place here because it only gives you 24 frames per second and 60 interlaced. More on that 60 interlaced in a minute. In terms of overall image quality, the Sony a6000 is technically the better camera. But I gotta say, there have been so many times where I look at footage from the Sony NEX5r and I actually like that footage better. It's hard to explain, but the Sony NEX5r just kind of has character. It's a quality that you can't really define with technical specs. It's just, you have to just see it for yourself. As far as the Sony a5000 goes, the a5000 is great. I mean, it has a really good looking image in 24p. 60 interlace on the a5000, as I showed in the a5000 review, is just kind of gross and unusable. Overall though, all three cameras deliver a really good looking, really usable image. Now, as far as autofocus goes, unfortunately, it's not even close. The Sony a6000 not only comes out on top, but it's in first place by like a really unfathomably large margin. If the autofocus on these cameras were cars, the Sony a6000 is $1 million Bugatti Veyron, and the other two are a couple of 2004 Honda Civics. It's not even remotely close. However, in the battle for second place, the Sony NEX5r does come out on top. The NEX5r actually has phase detect autofocus, albeit a much older iteration of phase detect. The a5000, even though it's a newer camera, it only uses contrast detect autofocus. Overall, the autofocus on the a5000 isn't bad, but it's just nowhere near as good as modern Sony cameras. And so, if you're looking at any of these cameras as a backup camera to something that you already have, like a B cam, you might be a little bit disappointed with the a5000. On the other hand, if you're not used to Sony at all and you're just coming into this system brand new, a5000's fine. It's just not as good as the NEX5r, and it's nowhere near as good as the Sony a6000. In terms of the overall user experience, the Sony a6000 comes out on top. I mean, you've got a mode dial and you have all these customizable buttons. It just makes it a lot like easier to use, and it creates like a quicker workflow. Whereas the other two, you're going to find yourself constantly looking through the menus to change whatever settings you need to change. I will say though, a6000 is a little bit more frustrating in terms of YouTube though, because it lacks that flip up screen, whereas the other two both have that flip screen, and that makes filming so much easier. The NEX5r, on the other hand, has this problem, and maybe it's just mine, but it has a problem where you have to push the record button like 2 or 3 times just to get it to start or stop recording. And after, say, 8 years of experience of that every single day, it does get frustrating after a while. Whereas the experience on the a5000 is perfectly fine and the a6000 is perfectly fine. It's basically exactly what you would expect it to be. Now, one important thing to note in terms of user experience is the a5000 has a genuine problem with overheating. Now, a6000 and the NEX5r don't overheat at all. The a5000, it's fine if you film in short clips, but if you film anything longer than 8 to 10 minutes, it's not a matter of will it overheat, it's a question of when will it overheat. You know, and with the a5000, when you get that overheat warning, it ends up shutting itself down about a few seconds after that, and then you just kind of have to stand around, wait for the camera to cool down until you can even turn it on and start recording again. That gets pretty annoying. That creates kind of a frustrating experience, whereas with the a6000 and the NEX5r, neither one of them have that problem. Overall, I would say that if you have the budget, then yes, the a6000 probably still is the camera for you. So if you're debating between the two cheaper cameras, the NEX5r, even though it's older, it's still the better option. The NEX5r, you get phase detect autofocus and you get just a better overall image, whereas with the a5000, you're still getting just a kind of slow contrast detect autofocus and the image is just pretty good. It's not bad, but it's just nowhere near as good as what you're getting from the NEX5r or the a6000. Anyway, I think that's all I've got for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.